So very warm welcome to Dr. Satyalokam from Microsoft Research India, Bangalore. Dr. Satya is senior researcher at MSR, and his research interests are in cryptography and complexity theory. In crypto, specifically interested in digital signatures, anonymous credentials, attribute-based and functional encryption, and recently more into blockchain. Very hot topic. So, and before moving to Microsoft Research in 2006, Dr. Satya was a faculty member at University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. He received his PhD from University of Chicago, and he held postdoctoral positions at University of Toronto and the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. And he has done his master's from IIT Madras and his bachelor's from NIT Warangal. So very warm welcome to Dr. Satyalokam.
Thank you, Srinivas Vivek. I'm happy to be here. I'm going to talk about confidentiality in blockchains. Well, like I was saying, I started with an ambitious agenda, and then I realized I probably won't be able to do all of that. So, but here is an outline that I had in mind. So I will cover very quickly some preliminaries on blockchain. For the purposes of this talk, as well as for the purposes of cryptography, it's a good idea to think about Bitcoin as the prime example of blockchain. For many people, blockchain means Bitcoin, but it's not. That's important to note. But in any case, we will keep a specific example in mind, and that example could be Bitcoin, some kind of digital currency. Okay. And then I'm going to talk about a particular, another digital currency called Zcash. And Zcash is different from Bitcoin, but it is different in a very interesting sense. Namely, it allows transactions to be anonymous and confidential. And we'll come to the details of these things. And that's an important advantage in many applications. Whereas in Bitcoin, this is not the case. Okay? And I'm going to drop the remaining 4 bullets for this talk, because I thought that instead of giving a survey of a lot of things, I should focus on one thing and try to make it as clear as possible. And that's what I'm going to do. Okay? So let's start. Blockchain. What's a blockchain? We should really think about a blockchain as though it's a bulletin board. Think about a village where people want to conduct transactions with each other. Let's say financial transactions, just to be concrete again. And we really want to think about a bulletin board of transactions where, if somebody, I'm sorry about the color here again. If A wants to pay B, 10 rupees, they will, A will pay 10 rupees to B, and they will put a note on this bulletin board saying, A will sign it. Let's say for the moment, A will sign it, saying, I pay 10 rupees to B. I mean, initially, you would also want B to sign it, saying that they received it. But let's say whenever somebody says they paid, the other person actually received it. Okay? So that's a transaction. And that transaction is written on the bulletin board, which means it's visible to everybody. And it's a proof that the transaction actually happened. Okay? So, and that's where the immutability comes, in the sense that this is a public bulletin board. And let's say this is robust enough that nobody is going to tamper with it. And it's visible to everybody. So these two properties, transparency, which means public verifiability, and immutability are the two main properties of blockchain that we are going to use, and that Bitcoin uses, and everybody who wants to use blockchains in various applications use this. So for this reason, blockchains are also called distributed ledgers. Okay, distributed because, well, first of all, in my toy example, I talked about a bulletin board that's visible to everybody. But of course, this bulletin board has to be maintained by somebody, and this bulletin board has to be protected by somebody. And in the new technology, what we do is everybody keeps a copy of the bulletin board on their computer. That's a simplification, but let's go with it, okay? Everybody keeps a copy, and every transaction gets written in everybody's ledger, okay? And therefore, everybody can verify. And only when everybody says they have verified the validity of the transaction, will the transaction be confirmed, will the transaction be actually written on the ledger. And that's what we call consensus. So consensus is extremely important in blockchains, and that's kind of, what gives the finality to transactions through public verifiability. So the way you want to think about it is it's an immutable distributed ledger where public verifiability is guaranteed for every transaction that gets written into this ledger. And this public verifiability and finality of transactions is enabled by consensus among the participants of the blockchain. Okay. The data structure, again, the last two things are more computer science terminology than what this picture shows. First of all, instead of writing individual transactions and and sequencing them, the order of transactions is extremely important. By the way, the order of transactions is also important. You don't want to say A paid B, 10 rupees in the wrong order. Okay. Otherwise, the balances in respect to accounts will be all wrong, right? So the order of transactions is important. You could write individual transactions into a long linked list, kind of a data structure, but for various reasons, mostly to do with implementation details and efficiency, you group transactions into blocks, and that's where the blockchain comes in. And the way you chain the blocks is through cryptographic hashes. Okay, so every block, you probably heard about many of these things. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay. So every block has a hash pointer. What we mean by hash pointer is that the hash of the previous block is what we use to refer to this. Okay, so that's this. Okay, that's what we call hash pointer. Instead of linked lists, we use hash values as pointers. That's all. Okay.
So the hash value will be the hash of the entire block.
The entire block. Yes. Yeah. So that you can find it, and you only can find the previous block. Okay, just like in a linked list. Okay. And so now you have to have, I won't go into too many details here because they are not needed for this talk, but basically you have to have analogs of whatever I said before. Namely, it should be immutable, and there should be consensus on the way that these blocks are chained together, and what else? And then verifiability of transactions. So all of those things need to be enforced in the digital world by, among the blocks. Okay. First of all, think about the block as just a sequence of transactions, and therefore, might as well think about verifying a block being verifying transactions. Namely, verifying a block amounts to at least verifying every transaction that is in the block and more. And that more is what gets done, for example, in Bitcoin or many so-called public blockchains where anybody can participate. You have so-called minor nodes. Okay. By the way, in blockchain, every participant is called a node, like a node in a network. Okay. So the minor nodes are the ones who are going to create blocks by basically, these are the maintainers in some sense of the blockchain. So when you have a transaction that you want to be recorded in the blockchain, like you paid somebody some money or some Bitcoin, you basically send that transaction to all the miners, or send the transaction to the entire network. but if you are not a miner, you don't do much with the transaction. So again, as a simplification, we can assume that everybody is a miner. In fact, this is a good assumption or a good model to keep in mind. And in some sense, I don't want to digress too much. In some sense, the way Bitcoin differs from this ideal is by concentration of miners. So in an ideal blockchain, anybody could be a miner, and therefore everybody is trying to mine the next block. Okay, so miners create blocks, and they, as I said, creating a block first of all involves verification of transactions, and so again, think about verification of transactions in the simplest terms would mean that if a person X is paying a certain amount of money to person Y, that person X's balance has enough of that money, and person Y is a legitimate participant on the block, and that the signature on this transaction by person X, who is paying Y money, is actually a valid signature. In other words, A is vouching to pay this money, and so on. So all of these are, go into verification of transactions, and then they have to do what is called a proof of work, and this is actually the most important component of mining, most important and most expensive part of creating a new block. In order to create a new block, they have to solve what is called a cryptographic hash puzzle, and I will say a little bit more about it, but not too much. And solving that cryptographic hash puzzle, you probably remember about hash functions. If I give you the image of a hash function, inverting the hash function, not necessarily inverting, but finding a pre-image of a hash function is extremely hard, computationally hard. Okay, and that hardness of computing a pre-image of a hash function is what is used in hash puzzles. Okay, so in a hash puzzle, basically what you're trying to do is you're trying to compute a hash that has a certain pattern in some positions, and that's, so it's actually easier than computing a pre-image, but still can be hard if this pattern is long enough. Okay, and that's kind of what is involved in mining. So you have to find the pre-image that has this pattern and can be part of the hash of the previous block. And that's where the miners have to do a lot of computational work. You might have heard about mining farms. In Bitcoin, there are these mining farms because this computation is extremely expensive. A lot of computers are needed, a lot of hardware tricks are needed in order to invert these hash functions. And that's what miners do. And that's a proof that they have the incentive to create this block. And that's also, of course, if they create a block which has invalid transactions, they're wasting their time, they're wasting their money and energy, right? So because other people are going to verify the validity of these transactions also. So they verify the transactions, which is the easy part. The hard part is solving the hash puzzle. Once they verify the transactions, solve the hash puzzle, they create a new block. I'm skipping a lot of details. They create a new block, and the new block will have a pointer to the most current block, the most recent block on the blockchain. That's how the blockchain gets extended.
It's an assumption that we are not solving we are not finding pre-image in the proper sense. It's just that we are finding pre-image of some specially selected values that have a specific pattern, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
And is there a guarantee that such things exist, or it's just an assumption?
Well, like anything that has to do with hash functions, it is a hardness assumption about hash functions. How do we know that SHA-256 is not invertible or SHA-256 is collision resistant? Okay, but what we do, the kind of assumption that is used is that a hash function behaves more or less like a random function, and therefore, if this pattern is 200 bits, it takes about 2 to the 200 attempts to find a pre-image of this hash function, which has those 200 bits in those positions.
So we need not wait like few hundred years to get it, is it?
Okay, so that's where this 200 number makes a difference. Okay, so if it is 200, obviously nobody is going to ever be able to, mine a block, because inverting a hash image with 200 fixed bits is almost as good as inverting the entire hash, and that's going to take forever. Okay, so this is called the hardness of the hash puzzle. The pattern currently is 64 bits. So 2 to the 64 is a lot of time, but not like impossibly long. It's not like millions of years. So if you have what we call 2 to the 64 computational effort, and you can measure the computational effort in any reasonable sense, maybe the number of instructions that you need to execute on a computer, or if you're using many computers to do it, altogether how many instructions these computers are doing, and so on. So 2 to the 64 is kind of doable effort, but not affordable effort. Not everybody can do it. You really have to work hard to do this, and therefore you are spending time, and indirectly you are spending a lot of computational effort, and for buying the computers, for paying the electricity that is used by these computers, you are in some sense paying money, right? Now, if you are paying money to create a block and you are not doing the transactions, why are you doing it, right? So that's where the mining reward comes in, and the mining reward, there is a certain amount of mining reward for creating the block, and there is also a certain amount of money that comes from each of these transactions. So every transaction has a small amount of cost. Like, you pay a certain amount of money when you use your credit card. I mean, you don't pay, typically the merchant pays, but sometimes, indirectly, of course, you are paying because the merchant is indirectly going to charge you for it. But in any case, whenever a transaction is done, there is a certain amount of transaction fee that's involved. And so each of these transactions also comes with a certain amount of reward for having them verified and putting them into a block. So that's the incentive for miners, and that's the reason why mining is a big business in Bitcoin or any digital currency. And this kind of, I didn't go into the details, and we really don't need it for the purposes of this talk. So this is called a proof of work-based consensus. You have to think about, what happens if two miners simultaneously produce two blocks, and what happens if the miners are not honest, and so on. Because the miners could favor some transactions against the others, and the miners could, indirectly make their own transactions. So all of these things are important to consider. But one major assumption that we make is, I kind of, didn't write it correctly. It's not that majority of miners are honest. It's actually not numerically. It's actually that if you think about the computational effort of, collective computational effort of all the participants on the blockchain, a majority of that computational effort is among honest miners. That is the assumption. So if every miner is equally powerful, then this makes sense. Majority of miners are honest. But the real assumption is that majority of the computational effort is in honest hands. That's the assumption. Yes, you have a question.
One of the important aspects of blockchain are the difficulty of hash function.
Yes.
And the limitations of computational ability.
Correct.
So with the advent of quantum computing, will blockchain become, the concept of technology will become limited?
Very good question. Yes, to a certain extent. Therefore, you have to choose your hash functions very carefully. In fact, you have to choose, there's a lot of crypto underlying blockchains. For example, the digital signatures that go with transactions also have to be unforgeable. And all of these are, to varying degrees, affected if, for example, quantum computers become a reality. In blockchains, the hash functions, we think, the hash functions will remain secure even after quantum computers. Again, that's kind of an assumption. The currently like SHA-256, right? The currently secure or currently hash functions which are considered currently secure will very likely remain secure even after quantum computers come. That we all believe that. Of course, this is just a belief. It could very well be that a few years down the line, somebody comes up with a magical, efficient attack on hash functions using quantum computers, but that hasn't happened so far. The other component, the digital signatures, on the other hand, are under serious threat if quantum computers become reality. And the reason is that almost all blockchains, including Bitcoin, use digital signatures based on elliptic curves. And discrete log problem, and variations of the discrete log problem, are the underlying mathematical assumption for all these digital signatures and encryption. Many of the encryption schemes are also either based on RSA or on discrete logs, and all of these are under threat if quantum computers become a reality. So yes, altogether, the blockchain technology will be under tremendous danger if quantum computers do come into existence. Yes. Yes.
So you mentioned that each transaction should be verified by all the miners. That means the
Could be potentially. Yeah.
So the same block is created by each of the miners.
No. Before the block gets added to the blockchain, the verification gets done. Who gives what? Puzzles. No. It's basically this puzzle is okay. This puzzle is based on a given hash function. The hash function is part of the definition of the blockchain. Let's say SHA-256 for Bitcoin. Okay, and then the pattern is just all zero pattern in certain positions. The length of the pattern.
I'll go the description, is it?
Yeah, it's part of the description of blockchain. No. A puzzle involves a lot of things, right? A puzzle involves a hash function, a pattern in certain positions, and you have to compute the hash of the previous block such that this pattern appears in those positions. So that part, the part that depends on the previous block, that part will change. Okay, the pattern, at least for now, the pattern in Bitcoin is the same. The pattern in certain positions, but the remaining positions are essentially random. Okay. Any more questions? Okay. So like I said, consensus is an important, very important, in fact, for all blockchains. But we don't need it for this talk. Okay, sorry. Okay, I'll go back to the previous slide. But the only thing I want to say is that with Bitcoin, the consensus is called Nakamoto consensus, and it's based on this notion of proof of work that I just described. And there are other ways of arriving at consensus on what the next block is. And this is an extremely important component of all blockchains. But for the purposes of this talk, we just need to understand that there needs to be a consensus protocol. And that consensus protocol involves verification of transactions by anybody in the blockchain, potentially anybody in the blockchain, and therefore, the consensus defines what it means for a transaction to be valid. Okay, or in other words, to execute consensus, verification of transactions by essentially anybody in the world is necessary. Okay, so that's the important point for the rest of this talk. And as a result, okay, because verification should be possible by anybody, this is what I mentioned as public verifiability, right? The details of the transaction at the outset should be public, right? So this is true in Bitcoin, for example. So the amount of money that goes from one participant to another participant is actually public in Bitcoin. Otherwise, you won't be able to check whether the sender has enough balance to send to the receiver. And I won't spend too much time on this. So if you are making at least the transaction amount public, this may not be very appealing in some scenarios, right? It's not exactly analogous to transactions that we do in real life, because we often want our transaction, the details of the transactions, how much money we paid to somebody, to be private, to be confidential, okay? And this is especially true if you are a business. I mean, if businesses are, selling goods to each other, and if there is a competitive market, you would like the transaction amounts to be private. And often we also want the transacting parties to have private identities. We don't want to reveal who we are paying money, and sometimes people don't want to reveal their own identities when they are paying money. Now in Bitcoin, this is not exactly true, in the sense that people have Bitcoin identities, or so-called addresses, which are their pseudonyms, their identities on the Bitcoin. And Bitcoin allows a person, a real person, or a real computer, or a real entity, to create several pseudonyms, okay? In that sense, it might sound like in Bitcoin, anonymity is given. I mean, anonymity exists. In other words, a sender, in fact, a sender creates a new address, or new public coin, or public key, a public key for every transaction. And similarly, a receiver could potentially create lots and lots of addresses for receiving, and therefore, basically they could hide among the crowd, right? But an important thing is that this is not complete anonymity, okay? It's not complete anonymity because the flow of transactions, the flow of money is still visible on the Bitcoin blockchain. So if you kind of, have abstract entities, but then you see who is paying, as an abstract entity, who is paying to who, how much money, you can create a graph of transactions, and from this graph of transactions, you can infer something about the entities who are doing these transactions, okay? So you could identify, for example, nodes which have been transferring a lot of money out of them, or you could also identify nodes which are receiving lots of money, and so you could kind of identify some amount of real information from the addresses that are involved in the graph of transactions. Okay, so Bitcoin, like public blockchains, are not exactly anonymous, and they're definitely not confidential with respect to transaction amounts. Okay, so these are the two problems that we would like to solve. We would like, first of all, the parties involved in a transaction to be really anonymous. When we say really anonymous, we are talking about in a cryptographic sense. Okay, so if you look at the blockchain, and if you look at these nodes that are in the transaction graph, you should still not be able to identify. And the second is, of course, the details of the transaction. Okay, the amount of transaction. So this is what I didn't formally define, but this is kind of intuitively what we mean by confidentiality in blockchains. Yes?
So you mentioned transactions in order.
Yeah.
So does that mean that there's some kind of timestamp also maintains maybe that will give information about the...
Right. I mean, timestamp is not explicitly maintained because the timestamp is just the order in which the transactions appear. Okay, but timestamp, as far as I know, has not been used to de-anonymize Bitcoin nodes. Money flow has been shown to be useful to identify parties involved in big transactions, at least the big transactions in a blockchain. But timestamp has not been. I mean, it could be. I don't know. But so far, it hasn't been used to de-anonymize. Yes. Right.
But aren't you supposed to do this, solve the same challenging problems like any
Yeah, yeah.
So it's computation very expensive to do something like that. I mean, you're saying that it's possible, but
No, no, sorry, I didn't understand what you mean by it is possible. What is it?
transaction graph is what brings the vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
The transaction graph.
Are you saying analyzing the transaction graph is hard?
So in order to do that, are you supposed to solve the challenge for each and every block?
No, 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 no. Once you put it, okay, so that's actually, okay, actually it's a very good point. I forgot to mention this. So solving the puzzle is hard, but verifying if somebody has solved the puzzle is trivial, okay? So just like hash functions. If I give you the hash value, going to a pre-image that gives you the hash value is extremely hard. But if I told you, here is the pre-image and here is the hash value, you can very quickly verify it. So once stuff gets recorded on the blockchain, anybody can very quickly verify that the blockchain is correct, okay? Only creating a block is hard, okay? So if you want to analyze the blockchain, you can quickly traverse the blockchain, and you can create, and because the transactions are public, you can quickly, basically draw a graph indicating transactions. You had a question?
Sir, are the public addresses remain same? Do they remain same for all the transactions?
No, 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 they don't.
So how can we plot a graph if the public addresses do not remain same?
Okay. Again, just based on the money transactions.
For a particular transaction, we can plot a graph.
Right.
But we can't infer a pattern just by looking at a transaction.
You can, because the signatures are typically invariant. Only the public public keys. I keep saying coins. I don't know. Public keys for transactions are different, but the digital signatures. I mean, typically, okay. Again, this is sort of a hidden assumption that a real user, a single real user, is going to have only one secret key for signatures. Okay, so I mean, if you have multiple signing keys, you are actually multiple people. This is the assumption. Okay, of course you could have million private keys for signing, but then it's difficult for you to manage.
But private keys are not publicly available.
Private keys are not, but the signatures are available. And in digital signatures, we typically have a one-to-one mapping between private keys and verification keys. At the user end, yes. Yeah. So when you register as a user on Bitcoin or any public blockchain, any blockchain for that matter, you generate a signing key and a verification key. You publish your verification key. You keep the signing key with you. In a digital signature, if you have, sorry? You typically give a sufficiently pseudo-random seed. So there are standard cryptographic algorithms, cryptographic tools that you can use to generate nearly pseudo-random, nearly random, if not completely random, seed, and you use that seed to generate randomness, and the keys that you use in digital signatures are based on this randomness. And there are standard methods to generate randomness, pseudo-randomness, I should say. True randomness is difficult to, it's a mathematical definition, it's difficult to say what is truly random, but for all practical purposes, there are efficient pseudo-random generators and you use those. Yes?
Is all the mining done by forces?
Currently, yes. That's the only way we know. Yeah. That's a property of the hash function. The only way we know how to break some of the well-known hash functions is by brute force. Yes?
What if a single entity owns like 61% of the miners?
I'm sorry, what?
What if a single actor owns like 61% of the miners?
Then Bitcoin is dead. And almost any blockchain is dead. Yeah. But a single entity holding 51% of the computational effort is almost impossible. What can happen, and what does happen in real life today, is that a large number of miners or a large number of entities can collude and create what is called a mining form. So they basically cooperate with each other to solve the puzzles quickly. Of course, the speed with which you solve the puzzles is what gives you the advantage, right? So a large number of people can get together and pool their computational resources and try to become very efficient miners and thereby gain advantage, okay? So this collusion or pools, mining pools, is where the danger to Bitcoin comes from, yes? In Bitcoin, several thousands, but it's only thousands, that's the danger actually. It's like, you know, tens of thousands. Something like that, yeah. Correct, yes.
Because if I also have to do some transaction, I don't have that much computation capability, so I will just do my transaction, but I can't verify.
No, you can verify the transaction. I mean, you can definitely verify the transaction. You cannot make sure, okay, what you cannot do without help from miners. Yes, absolutely right, and that's actually a problem with Bitcoin.
Yeah, so if you wanted to make it decentralized.
Right, it is decentralized. I mean, in kind of, in a very theoretical sense, you can say it is decentralized only among those 12,000 and not among the millions of Bitcoin users. Right, I mean, the number of Bitcoin users is currently of the order of millions, tens of millions even, okay? But the number of miners is currently only tens of thousands. I mean, miners who basically can play the game. I mean, people who don't have this kind of computational resources have dropped out of the mining business long time ago. So only the people who have huge amounts of computational power, either by themselves or because they pull together, you know, a bunch of people, maybe thousands of people, I don't know, thousands of people come together and use all their computers together to do the mining. So the number of mining pools is currently, you know, 12,000 or something. So that is a problem. I mean, it is decentralized only among those 12,000 for all, you know, in principle. Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, this is actually, I mean, it's a digression. This is different from what I'm going to talk about. But, so, this is a problem with proof of work. Okay. This is not a problem with, well, I mean, every consensus protocol has its own problems. But the way that this problem is solved is by coming up with other kinds of consensus protocols where your ability to mine a block or to create the next block does not depend on your computational power. Okay, there are such consensus protocols. I mean, there are consensus protocols called proof of stake. So there's another popular blockchain called Ethereum, which is another currency, you know, not as popular, nearly as popular, but not exactly as popular as Bitcoin. And Ethereum also currently uses proof of work based consensus, but it's going to change to a different kind of consensus called proof of stake. I mean, proof of stake has its own problems, but basically there your success probability of creating the next block depends not on your computational power, but the amount of money that you have in the blockchain. Okay, it's a, I mean, you can imagine it has its own problems, but basically that's another way, that's one way you can avoid this challenge. Okay, so there are, you know, various other kinds of consensus protocols that people are working on. Okay, but 12,000 is still a large enough number that people seem comfortable, and these 12,000 people, 12,000 pools rather, are still, you know, diverse enough, distributed enough around the globe that people don't think, you know, they will collude so much to gather 51% of the computational power. I'm sorry?
We are using this for a cryptocurrency. We have several banks distributed all over.
Correct.
And here also we need to pay transaction fees.
Correct.
The banks also we need to pay transaction fees.
Yeah, but there you are trusting banks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Here we are trusting those standards.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
Why?
Well, so that's a good question. The banks could be miners, but the more important thing is that here there is public verifiability, or so personally, I would feel equally comfortable if these 12,000 miners are replaced by 12,000 banks, but every transaction that I do with a bank is verified by all 12,000, potentially all 12,000 banks. But that doesn't happen with banks today, right? Yes, banks, there are, maybe, if you take the big banks, maybe they're about the same number as the number of miners, maybe even more, which is good. The more miners you have, the better. But banks don't, in fact, banks definitely don't want to open up their balance sheets to other banks.
And we also don't want to make it our transaction.
Yeah. So that problem we are going to solve. We are going to solve that problem, right? What we don't have with banks is mutual verifiability. Okay. So in fact, again, this is not the main topic of this talk, but there are these consortium blockchains, which is sort of different from public blockchains. Bitcoin is a public blockchain; anybody can participate. In consortium blockchains, you have things like entities like banks, entities like governments, maybe 1,000 of them, hopefully, but currently you can't handle 1,000 size consortia, but let's say hundreds of them. Okay, that's a technology limitation, not the principal limitation. But in any case, an ideal scenario, let's say these 12,000 banks come together and form a consortium, and if they use a consortium blockchain, then the concern that you have will be the concern that you have and the concern that I have will both be addressed, in the sense that it will still be banks, and therefore they can continue to do what they're currently doing, and you could still derive benefits from a blockchain like in Bitcoin because they verify each other's transactions. So this collective verifiability is what does not exist in the current banking system. And again, as I said, it's a completely different direction from Bitcoin-like scenario, but these consortium blockchains, so-called consortium blockchains, is a way that many banks are pushing the blockchain adoption. Okay? And in consortium blockchains, again, you get all kinds of efficiency compared to the current very manual or very bureaucratic processes, and you have more transparency.
Sir,
Yes.
When we compare the banks with the blockchain or
Yes.
Bitcoin, one important feature which we have to think is that whenever we do a transaction in a bank, indirectly bank is giving permission to us to do the transaction. But in Bitcoin, we don't require any other permission.
No, actually that is not true. The bank, why should the bank give you permission to use your money? In fact, you are giving permission to the bank to, transfer your money, from one account, from your account to another account. In fact, this is the point that you, again, this is a digression and a philosophical argument. You are somehow treating the bank as an authority, in fact, as a trusted authority. And this is the thing that you want to overcome. You don't want to have trusted authorities because that trusted authority is often misused. Okay? And the reason why Bitcoin is so popular, especially among people who don't want to trust governments and banks, is because of this. Because there is no reason, strictly speaking, there is no reason for you to trust a bank if all you want is a transaction between you and another person. Okay, you could create, and that's what Bitcoin or that's what blockchain does, is you could create a trust environment where you don't have any individual or any small number of trusted authorities who you need to depend on in order to have a secure transaction. Right?
I have heard in some cases, due to some system error, the bank account got freezed. So even though they have sufficient balance in their account, they couldn't do the transaction.
Yeah, well, okay, so that's a different problem. That problem can happen with blockchains also, right? It could happen that, half of the earth loses electricity for whatever reason, some, catastrophic event. And then, that's a technological problem. That can happen any day for any infrastructure. But that's different from trust assumptions, right? The bank is never going to guarantee you that they will never have a power failure. So it's not a problem because we don't trust the bank, and it's also not a problem that can be solved by trusting the bank. Okay. All right. So, well, let's now come to the main topic, namely confidentiality. Okay, this I already talked about, confidentiality in blockchain. So, like I said, I mean, the main goal in confidentiality is to, let me just say, to hide the details of a transaction. Details of a transaction, you could think about them minimally as the amount of money that goes from one party to another party. But you could also think about it more generally as not only the money, but also the addresses where the money is going from and where the address where the money is going to. Okay. So for the purposes of this talk, because our goal is to understand the crypto foundations of this topic, we will not worry too much about the details that are being verified when you want to validate a transaction. So there is some function, okay? We now think in, as a cryptographer, as a theoretical computer scientist, there is some function that takes the inputs written in a transaction as input to the function and outputs whether this transaction is valid or not, okay? And this validity function needs to be evaluated in order to run the consensus protocol and create the next block. And because these transaction details are visible to everyone who is running the consensus protocol, which potentially could be everyone in the world, everyone on the blockchain, you lose anonymity and confidentiality. And that's the problem we want to solve, okay? And how do we solve it? And the dilemma here is that you have a function that you want to evaluate on a bunch of inputs, and without evaluating that function, you won't be able to validate the transaction, but at the same time, those inputs are exactly the ones that you want to hide, okay? How do we do that? Anybody? Sorry? Homomorphic encryption. Well, so homomorphic encryption might be too powerful a tool. Yes, you can do it. Yes, you can use homomorphic encryption, actually. Well, actually, no, I would, no. We're getting into a little bit of technical details of what we mean by homomorphic encryption, but something like homomorphic encryption would work. Let me just quickly spend one sentence saying what the difference is. In homomorphic encryption, the result of the computation is also encrypted. So if you don't have the key, you can't even learn the result of the computation. What we want here is we don't want to learn the inputs of the function, inputs to the function, but we want to learn the output of the function, right? That's what, I mean, as a miner or, as somebody who is validating a transaction, what I want is I want the inputs to my function to be encrypted so that I don't learn the values of those inputs. So that preserves the confidentiality of the parties in the transaction and the values that they are using in the transaction and so on. So you want the inputs to be encrypted, but the output to be visible. Okay, this is how what we want is different from homomorphic encryption.
I don't even MPC is also not going to work, is it?
Well, so no, MPC also does not work because in MPC, the inputs to the respective parties are encrypted with their keys, and they know the inputs. Okay, so they can evaluate whatever function they want on their private inputs. Only, in an MPC, let's say if there are 3 players, the first player doesn't know what the second and third player have, but he knows the inputs that he is computing on, right?
So what is the output exactly?
Let's say no, the output is just true or false, right? I mean, this is a transaction, right? So there is some definition of what a valid transaction is, right? So the output is a Boolean output. It's just true or false.
We're just talking about the base validity, not about the proof of work.
No, forget proof of work. I'm now beyond consensus. There is some consensus protocol, maybe proof of work, maybe something else, but every consensus protocol in a blockchain, right, anytime you want to create a blockchain, right? Anytime you want to create a blockchain, you need to validate transactions. I mean, you meaning you need not be participants of the transaction. You are a verifier, okay? A general public verifier, okay? So how do you validate the transaction if you don't know the inputs to the transaction? Because the inputs ideally should be encrypted, so you don't learn the, yes? So public key cryptography is impractical. It's not unusable in theory, but it's impractical because since you don't know who is going to verify the transactions, you basically have to encrypt it with everybody's keys. Okay? So that would mean that your transaction is this much, but the encryption would be a million times that much because you have to encrypt it with million public keys. And of course, they can all do computation locally, and I mean, using their own decryption algorithm, and then discover the value. So that's a good suggestion, but not practical. Good question. This is a good point. So you see what the problem is with the public key thing? Yes. Okay. So with public key, there is actually a more important problem. Namely, you decrypt, you learn the values. The whole point of doing confidential transactions is that the verifier should not know the values of the transaction. I mean, the data of the transaction. So it is true that the person other than the verifier is not going to learn what the verifier is doing, but it's the same transaction that is broadcast to everybody, encrypted with their respective public keys. So everybody essentially learns the details of the transaction. So zero-knowledge proofs is the key. Okay, is the word here that I'm looking for. So zero-knowledge proofs. Okay. So I don't know. You talked about zero-knowledge proofs a little bit, right? So how do we think about zero-knowledge proofs? Zero-knowledge proofs is you have a secret, let's say your password, okay? And you want to show me that you have the correct password, okay? I can verify whether it's a valid password or not, but the catch is you don't want to tell me your password, okay? And so what you need to do is you need to convince me that your password is a real password that you have in your head, okay? And so I have to convince myself, I have to verify that your password is actually a valid password without learning the password itself. And that's what we do in zero knowledge, right? So a simple, okay, so I'll come back to this.
Yeah, so we discussed graph like next one.
Right. So here is a zero knowledge proof in a much more laymanish way. And it's not really a mathematical zero knowledge proof. It's just a way to think about it to begin with. Suppose, for the rest of the talk, my prover will be called Bob and my verifier will be called Alice. Okay? Now, the prover, Bob, says, I know the combination for that combination lock. And Alice says, prove to me that you know the combination for this lock. Of course, Bob doesn't want to give the combination. So a way that Alice can verify that Bob really knows the combination is to create this tunnel. This is a mental exercise. Don't think about practicality of this. You create this tunnel and then put the combination lock on a door in the middle of the tunnel. Okay? And then ask Bob to come either to the left or to the right based on verifier's demand. So, you send Bob into this tunnel and Alice flips a coin and says, come from the left. And then she flips the coin again and, maybe come from the left again or come from the right. Okay? And she can do this any number of times. And if every time Bob succeeds in coming from the left or coming from the right, then she can be pretty sure that he does indeed know the combination. But if Bob fails, well, actually it's the other way around. If Bob, okay, I have to be careful here. So the probability that Bob doesn't know the combination but passes this test is very small. Okay, does anybody have a guess? Suppose Alice asked this question 100 times, and in the case when Bob knows the combination, of course he will succeed every time. But if Bob doesn't know the combination, what's the probability that? Well, I mean, it's not zero, because it's quite possible that every flip was in favor of Bob, right? Yeah. Okay, that's extremely small. That's negligible. Okay, so if she does this 100 times, Alice can be practically guaranteed that Bob doesn't know the combination. Okay, so that's a zero knowledge proof. Of course, she doesn't know the combination. Okay, so Bob is able to convince Alice that he knows the combination if he does, and if he doesn't know the combination, with very high probability, with extremely high probability, practically one, Alice can catch him. So if he's a lying prover, the verifier can catch him. If he's an honest prover, meaning the claim that he made is actually correct, he will succeed in convincing the verifier. Okay, so this is a simple example of a zero knowledge proof, and it also implicitly tells you what the properties of a zero knowledge proof should be. Okay, if the prover knows, if the prover makes a valid claim, he should succeed with probability 1. If the prover makes an invalid claim, then the verifier should be able to catch the prover, a lying prover, a dishonest prover, with extremely high probability. Okay, so that's what we mean by a zero knowledge proof. All right, so we kind of know now that if we could build a zero knowledge proof system where the knowledge, what is the knowledge that we are trying to prove? What is the proof, rather, not knowledge. The knowledge is the details of the transaction, but the proof is that the transaction, the details of the transaction are actually valid, which means that a certain computation done on these values outputs true or false. Okay, so Alice and Bob, of course, know the statement of the claim. Okay, the statement of the claim here is the verification function. So they both know the verification function, and Bob has encrypted details of the transaction so that they are not obviously visible to Alice. And then they have to run a zero knowledge protocol so that Bob can convince Alice that the transaction is valid, and Alice learns nothing about the details of the transaction. Okay, so that's the goal. Now, how do we actually do this? So that's where some math and some crypto comes in. So one of the easiest, again, I'm sorry if you can't read some of the words, but an easy example in crypto for a zero knowledge proof is for the problem of discrete log. Okay, what's the problem of discrete log? First of all, what's discrete log? So you are talking about a group. You could think of Z mod T, if you have seen that. Okay, of a prime order, and for technical reasons, we are taking prime order groups. And so we make some assumptions about the hardness of discrete log-like problems. It's decisional Diffie-Hellman in this case. You probably have seen that. But this hardness assumption is widely recognized as, as being valid. In other words, we all believe that Diffie-Hellman assumption is correct. Otherwise, all our crypto is dead. And now, here is the claim. Here it's a mathematical claim that says that Bob says he knows an X such that a Y that he announced is G to the X. So in other words, he knows the logarithm of Y based G. Okay, but he doesn't want to reveal X. But he wants to convince Alice that he knows X, and Alice of course knows Y and G. Okay, so that's a problem. How can we do this? Here is a way to do this. So Bob is going to, in some sense, hide X in a linear function. So, sorry about these red things, they may not be visible. If it's not visible, let me know and I will write them on the board. Okay. So what Bob does is he picks a random, I didn't say random, but it is random. He picks a random element in Z mod Q, and he computes this masking function, let me call that a masking function, G to the R, and he also computes this secret S, which is C times X plus R. Okay, this is random, and where is C? Oh, I'm sorry, C he gets from Alice. Okay, I didn't say that, I'm sorry. So the verifier picks a random C, or whatever C that she wants, but she doesn't want to pick 0. It's not going to cover anything, right? So she picks a C and sends it to Bob. I mean, these two steps could be switched, it doesn't matter. But that is the C that he is going to use to hide X in, okay? And now the verifier is going to check whether G to the S, G to the secret S that she got from Bob is equal to E times Y to the C, okay? E is the masking thing that I said. E is the random mask. But of course, Bob doesn't want to reveal R also. I mean, if he reveals R, it's done, okay? And we also want this to be repeatable many, many times, okay? So that's why you should choose R randomly. And Y, of course, is known to Alice, and C is something that she chose. So quickly, you can verify. Let me, it's there, right? Yeah. So let's verify. I won't do this detailed calculations later, but this is the question that Alice is asking: is G to the S equal to E times Y to the C? So what is S? If Bob is not lying, right? If Bob really knows what X is, in other words, if X is log of Y, it is G to the Cx plus R, which is equal to G to the Cx times G to the R. Of course, G to the R is E, she knows that, and G to the C times X, actually I should have written the other way, G to the X times C, and she knows, I mean, she is the one who chose C, and G to the X, if Bob is not lying, is actually equal to Y, and Y, and so there is Y to the C times C, okay? So this test that Alice makes on her string C, her input C, and Bob's secret S will succeed if Bob is not lying. If Bob is lying, okay, if Bob is lying, what's the probability? I mean, I won't work it out. What's the probability that these equalities all hold? It's extremely small. I mean, it's not 0. Okay? You have to convince yourself of that, because, you know, some crazy algebraic properties might hold between C, X, R, and E, which will make these equalities hold, even if Bob is lying. Okay? You can think about it. And what you need to convince yourself is that the probability that those equalities hold is going to be very, very small, provided the Diffie-Hellman problem is hard. This is crucial. This is important in crypto, okay? Because correctness always comes down to, security rather, security always comes down to some hardness assumption. So if Alice does have the capability to solve the discrete log problem, you can convince yourself that she will learn X, okay? You have to think about it a little, but I won't, you can do this as a homework, okay? That's the first thing. If Alice doesn't know how to solve this Diffie-Hellman problem, Bob is secure. In other words, zero knowledge is guaranteed. Now, the correctness that this is in fact a valid proof, goes to saying that if Bob's X is not log of Y, the probability that this test succeeds is extremely small. This is the other part that you want to argue. So these are the two main claims, and you can prove these two. Okay? So this is a zero knowledge proof, modulo Diffie-Hellman assumption and the probability calculations that I mentioned. But functionally, this is how it will go. All right? Now, can we use this in a blockchain? I mean, not this per se, but suppose all you need to do is prove. Suppose we have somehow managed magically to convert validating a transaction into a discrete log. I mean, proving the knowledge of a discrete log problem. Are we done? Suppose the only thing that we need to do to validate a transaction is to prove that I know the discrete log of an element Y that announce. Okay. So Alice is the verifier, Bob is the prover. So Bob is somebody who created the transaction. Alice is somebody who is trying to create a block by validating the transaction. Okay. So why would we not be able to use this perhaps? Good point, yes, yeah. And more importantly, yes, I mean, that is true. So that's a bad thing, but more importantly, you don't even know who made this transaction. You don't know who to send that message to, right? So in other words, Alice and Bob cannot communicate with each other. Here, communication, interaction, this is what we call an interactive zero-knowledge proof. Communication between Alice and Bob is essential. So Alice needs to send C, Bob needs to send S, and then, I guess that's about it. I mean, no, Bob needs to send two messages actually, okay? So what are we going to do? I mean, so you could say, the crucial thing is this, that, I mean, in fact, what you said, the miner or the verifier needs to send the initial challenge. C stands for challenge, by the way. So the challenge string needs to go from the verifier to the prover during this zero-knowledge proof. So yeah, let's see. I mean, they do, because otherwise these computations don't make sense. I mean, that's an oversimplification. Let's not think about transactions as yet, okay? I mean, let's first understand the problem in the abstract, in the sense that, validating a transaction is a function, and that function here is just discrete log, okay? So it is nothing like a transaction, just as an example, just as a concept, okay? So the main point is that in an interactive zero-knowledge proof such as this, typically the challenger, or so the verifier, needs to send challenge texts to the prover, and this is not possible in many scenarios, including in Bitcoin. Okay, so what we need is what is called a non-interactive zero-knowledge proof. Okay, so a non-interactive zero-knowledge proof, in the case of discrete log, is relatively easy. Okay, so what is, oh, by the way, maybe I should have spent a little more. Let me say one more sentence, okay, about these equations, right? So we said that the probability that Alice catches a lying prover is somehow going to be a function of the probability that these equations are satisfied, even when Bob doesn't know the discrete log. And since I didn't work out the details, I'm not going to talk about it, but those probability calculations will all come down to whether the challenge that Alice has chosen is a good challenge or a bad challenge. It's a bad challenge if these equations are satisfied. It's a good challenge if these equations are not satisfied, because her goal is to basically catch a cheating prover, right? And so it's important that C is a random challenge so that this probability is extremely small. I mean, Alice doesn't want to choose a bad challenge, but many challenges are good, and that's what the conclusion will be from these probability calculations, and therefore she will choose a random C. Okay, so what we want is, instead of Alice sending a random C, she will generate a random C from stuff that Bob sends. Okay, this is how we are going to make it non-interactive. Of course, you have to be careful, because Bob shouldn't know, what C Alice is going to generate based on whatever he sends. Okay, so we do that using a hash function. Okay, hash functions, we know, behave like random functions. Okay, so this is the step that's crucial here. So in some sense, instead of Alice generating the randomness, Bob is generating it for her, but in a way that he doesn't have any control on. Okay, he has no choice, because he's going to choose a random R. Otherwise, he won't be able to hide his X. Okay, and if he picks a random R, this is also going to be random. Essentially, E is going to be random, and the hash function takes random stuff to random stuff. Okay, so that's how he's generating this random C, and then he does the same as before. He sends the E, he sends the secret, namely CX plus R, and Alice now verifies as before. Okay, instead of C, you now have H of E. Okay, and for all practical purposes, H of E is random, and therefore all the calculations that we have done before will continue to hold as long as H is a good hash function. Okay, so this now there is no interaction. Bob just sends these two numbers to Alice, and Alice computes this and verifies, right? So there are two assumptions here. One is the decisional Diffie-Hellman problem is hard, like before, and two, this hash function is a secure hash function. It behaves like a random function. Okay, so under these two assumptions, we now have a non-interactive zero-knowledge proof for proving that the prover knows the discrete log of Y.
So this proof is publicly posting the value of C so that the case comes up.
No, we don't want to do that, right? We don't want interaction.
So like put the same like somewhere that the sender can see it, so he doesn't actually send.
No, but you don't want to reuse the C. Every proof, I mean, you want to be able to prove many times to anybody, right? And so you can't put a single C that is used by everybody and in every verification protocol. C has to be different for C has to be random, and therefore it has to be different, essentially different for every protocol. If for every protocol you have to generate fresh random R and therefore a fresh random C. Okay?
Maybe I know ways to see that will work as well,
If other people can generate the same C that you are posting, then it's not good, right? So if it is based on some public information, anybody can generate that, and then your secret, it can't be zero knowledge, right? Okay, so these are the two main concepts that I want to get across for this talk, namely, what is the zero knowledge proof, how do we do it, for some mathematical properties like discrete log, and how do you make, at least in this case, an interactive zero knowledge proof into a non-interactive. Or maybe if you can come up with a non-interactive zero knowledge proof directly, that's fantastic. But often, it's easier to come up with an interactive zero knowledge proof and then make it into a non-interactive proof by tweaking, the communication that needs to happen from one side to the other. It doesn't matter now, because the more verifiers verify, the better.
Minus can't be verified.
Miners are actually the verifiers. Why not? The transactions are done by anybody on the blockchain. Miners can't be verifiers for their own transactions, yes. But miners, again, like we said, there may be hundreds of, tens of thousands of miners. So other miners are going to verify the transactions by the miners. So nobody, it doesn't make sense for anybody who made the transaction to verify the transaction, because that's corruption basically, and therefore it's important that an arbitrary person on the blockchain can verify a transaction. So that's also important. The verifier could be anything, because all they have to do is check a mathematical equation between the two values that are written by the prover. So anybody can do this. Here's the main point about Elgamal encryption. I don't know if you, so the main property which I want to talk about, discrete log also. Elgamal, I wrote as homomorphic properties of Elgamal, but this is basically a homomorphic property of discrete log, or exponentiation. So if you have two numbers, little a and little b, right? You take g to the a, g to the b, as we have seen before. If discrete log is hard, capital A does not reveal anything about little a, and similarly capital B doesn't reveal anything about little b. So this is the way of hiding things, okay? So that's the first point. Exponentiation in a group where discrete log problem is hard is a way of hiding stuff, okay? So this could be an amount of money in a transaction, but once you put not the money itself, but g to the money, then you are hiding the actual amount. Okay, this is kind of the key, one of the key points, okay? Now, the homomorphic property is extremely important here, because if I want to hide the sum of A and B without learning A and B, all I need to do is multiply capital A and capital B, right? If you multiply capital A and capital B, just simple algebra, you get g to the A plus B. Forget the randomness, g to the A plus B. So in some sense, if you only give me hidden values of transactions through capital A and capital B, I can compute the sum of those, hidden value of the sum of those transactions without learning either the values of the individual transactions or the sum of those transactions, okay? And this is good. And why is this good? Because ultimately, if you are doing, balancing the books, this is all that you need really. Addition is all that you need. You need one more thing, we'll come to that. Because you can, add up, all the amounts in one column, given the hidden values of those, and then you get a hidden value of the sum, and you get the hidden values on the right, and you could check the equality of those, because this does not kill the equality. If A equals B, capital A equals capital B, you can also check little a equals little b. Again, unless you solve the discrete log problem. So, in some sense, you can check if a bunch of numbers on the left-hand side add up to a bunch of numbers on the right-hand side just blindly, okay?
But this only works for small exponents.
Well, yeah, but the point is that these are small compared to what? Compared to the size of the group. And the size of the group is typically, 2 to the 256 or 2 to the, 2 to the 512. And so, your numbers are typically, even if you put all the money in the world together, is going to be less than 2 to the 100. So it's probably much less than 2 to the 100, maybe 2 to the 64 or something. So as long as the numbers are small, like you said, but those numbers are, for all practical purposes, small for the kinds of groups that we work in. So again, this is another main point I want to make here. Okay, let's not talk about Elgamal. So now I want to talk about Zcash. So I wanted to spend most of my time here, but I can't. So, but Zcash basically builds on, what I said was like, very simple ideas, but, those are kind of, intuitive ideas that go into building an anonymous digital currency system based on blockchains. You could think of Zcash as a confidential Bitcoin, okay? Doing the kinds of confidential transactions, enabling the kinds of confidential transactions that I just talked about. And the core science that enables Zcash is zero knowledge and non-interactive zero knowledge, okay? So I illustrated zero knowledge and non-interactive zero knowledge using discrete log, but as you have pointed out, that's not enough. That's really not what we want to do. We want to do it something with transactions, right? So now we are going to go to the other extreme, meaning now I don't want to talk about discrete log. I don't even want to talk about transactions. I want to talk about arbitrary functions. Of course, if I can do it for arbitrary functions, I can also do it for transactions, okay? So now I'm going to give a very general solution for verifying transactions, okay? So this is a very, in terms of research in cryptography, this is actually a very important development in the last, I don't know, 5-6 years. You can even say that, I'm not saying Zcash itself is a crypto breakthrough, it is, but the ingredients that go in, the cryptographic ingredients that go into building Zcash, all are breakthroughs in cryptography that happened over the last decade at most, okay? All right, so since I don't have time, what I'm going to do is this the eraser? No, that's not the eraser. That's the eraser. Okay, sorry.
Now you can go to the next page.
Oh, that's actually even better.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And now you need to switch to the pen mode.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to go through this slide very fast, and I'm going to ignore a lot of details, which kind of is necessary. So what this is saying is you want to turn computations into polynomials. Now, what is a computation? In general, any computation, I don't know if you guys have done this in this course or anywhere else, any computation can be written as a Boolean circuit, right? Using AND gates, OR gates, NOT gates, and so on, right? I mean, it could be humongous, but you can do it in principle. You can make any computation represented as a Boolean circuit. We're going to take a slight, we're going to make a slight simplification, and we're going to represent computations through arithmetic circuits. What are arithmetic circuits? Instead of AND or NOT, you use multiplication and addition, okay? And so we are going to think about arithmetic circuits, and let's think about a simple arithmetic circuit which takes some multiplication. Multiplications are the complex things. So let's do a bunch of multiplications and an addition, okay? So if I have some values here, you multiply those two, these two values you add, and you multiply the results, and that's the output of the function of this circuit, okay? So almost any arithmetic computation, if it doesn't involve divisions, can be written as an arithmetic circuit, okay? I mean, it's more generally true, but we can just assume that our computations are now arithmetic circuits. Now what we want to do is, given such an arithmetic circuit, we want to write a bunch of polynomials. I won't go into the details. By converting every step of the computation, a step of the computation here is a gate, an addition gate or a multiplication gate. Every step of the computation by a bunch of small polynomials, okay? So all I will say here is you choose what are called target points over a large finite field, and with every gate you associate a value, alpha g, for every gate g. So every gate has some value over a finite field associated to it, and then you write a polynomial. So for instance, okay, so let me see. Oh, actually you do this only for multiplication gates. I'm sorry, I didn't say that. With this, yeah, I did say that, distinct multiplication. There are only two multiplication gates. So perhaps, I will associate polynomial x minus 1 with this, okay? And maybe, x minus 2 with this, something like that, okay? and well, I didn't say what values I associated. I will associate 2 with this gate and 1 with this gate. Now, what good is that? What it says is that at value 2, this guy vanishes, but this guy doesn't, and vice versa. Okay? And so what I'm doing is that I'm writing polynomials. I mean, here it is a simple polynomial, but in general it is not. I'm writing polynomials. L stands for left wire, R stands for right wire. Every gate has only 2 wires, left wire and right wire, and an output wire. Okay? So with each wire, I'm going to write a little polynomial, and these polynomials are going to be, all of them are going to evaluate to 1 at the point that is the target point of that. So the target point of this, I said, is 2. I mean, it's not exactly 1, it's -1. Oh, no, it's actually 1. So in the other case, it's -1. But that's an easy thing to fix. Divide by the corresponding number. Okay, so as long as you get non-zero, you can always make it 1 by dividing appropriately, right? So the interesting thing is that these polynomials will evaluate to 1 at the right gate and 0 at every other gate. And then you combine these polynomials by simply taking a bunch of linear combinations. I'm running fast, so many of these details might not be clear, but you might have to reread them later. Okay? So in a computation, every wire is going to carry a certain value, right? And there are some inputs, and let me call those inputs C1, C2, C3, C4. And of course, this wire has some value, so let me call that C5, let me call this C6, let me call this C7. Okay? Now, the bottom C's are inputs, so they could be anything. But once you fix these, C5, C6, C7 are fixed, right? So if I'm trying to prove to you that my inputs encrypted compute a certain value, I have to prove to you that my encrypted inputs, when they go through this computation is known to you and me because this is the validity function of the transaction for instance. Okay, I have to prove to you that the output is C7. Okay, and that gets converted after you put these polynomials. I'm skipping the details to checking whether I haven't said that. Okay, so these are the polynomials that you just take by combining them. Overall, basically over all potential, all values on all wires, including the inputs as well as intermediate values. That's what a computation is, right? A computation is your input values and every intermediate value that you compute while evaluating that function. Okay, so that's the computation of this circuit on that input. Okay, and those become the coefficients of these polynomials, and then you combine this into another big polynomial in a certain way. So for instance, okay, so here is, okay, I don't think I have time, but so L times R, so let's look at L5 and R6 and O7, okay, so that's one, right? L5 is x minus 1 and R6 is also x minus 1 and O7 is also x minus 1, but then you have to be careful with the C's, right? So there is this guy is going to be multiplied by C5, this guy is going to be multiplied by, C6. Okay, I don't know how to erase a little thing. Okay, C6, and this guy is going to be multiplied by C7. Okay, if you just look at those sub functions, okay? And now when you put x equals 2, what do you get? You get C5 times C6 minus C7, right? So at x equals 2, you get C5 times C6 minus C7. If this gate were doing its job correctly, this should be 0. Because C5 times C6 equals C7, right? And this must hold at every gate because of the way we formed L, R, and O. Okay? Right? At x equals 2. Similarly, at x equals 1, and by the way, at x equals 2, this gate disappears because it has x minus 2, so it's 0. x minus 2 is 0. So you will get zeros for L and R and O in that place, right? So basically, when you substitute the gate values or target values for a gate, everybody disappears except that gate. And this equation basically says that gate is doing its job correctly. And therefore, if this polynomial satisfy this equation, then you know that every gate is doing its job correctly, and therefore the entire computation is correct. Okay? So that's a very quick way, a quick explanation as to how you can convert the validity of a computation into checking the validity of a polynomial equation. Okay? So now, if you want to prove in zero knowledge that a certain computation is doing, where is it? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. So I went too far. There's no way I'm going to complete this. So I'm going to skip through this. In a sense, what you want to take away from this slide is that polynomial identity that I showed on the previous slide is going to be correct with with certainty. It's going to be absolutely correct if the input values are chosen correctly. I mean, all the values, in fact, but the input and the output are the most important things. And if you don't choose them correctly, then the probability that the polynomial equation is going to be satisfied is extremely small. Okay, that intuitively follows from what we call Schwartz-Zippel lemma, but is also saying, it's also something that you already know in at least univariate polynomials. If I have a polynomial of degree d, it has at most d roots. But if d is small compared to the number of things that you are checking, then if you take a random point, it's extremely unlikely that the random point will be a zero of your polynomial. So intuitively, you should imagine that if you evaluated a polynomial at a random point, it's extremely unlikely that you will get a zero. Okay? And so that's kind of the crux of this. So if your claim about the computation was wrong, the polynomial identity that I said before is not going to hold. And therefore, if you evaluated it at a random point, it would be non-zero. Whereas if you evaluated those polynomials with the correct values, it will be zero. Okay? So that's the main idea of how you would convert, the property of a computation is converted to a property of polynomials. Now, we haven't yet said, about hiding, right? So that hiding comes, again, I'm going to go fast. That hiding comes from something like what we said about discrete log. Okay, you put things in the exponent so that, so this function phi that I wrote here is kind of taking stuff into the exponent. So the values are hidden. Okay? That's all I'm going to say. Let me skip this. I'm actually not going to do the zero knowledge. Actually, the zero knowledge is the hiding thing. But the non-interactive stuff I have not done. It's still interactive because, in order to verify the probability that in order to verify the polynomial identity, you have to have some interaction. But okay, so I'm short-circuiting all of those things. I'm coming here. So this is the hiding function, which should look familiar. Okay.